I want to discuss some good news and some bad news, both from two African states. Now, the interesting thing with this is that the good news, as I see it, is coming from a country that's often associated with bad news, and the bad news is coming from a country that is generally seen as more progressive overall. And I use the term very lightly. And the two countries I'm talking about is Sudan and Tunisia. I'm going to read out a report from the New York Times regarding Tunisia in a minute, but a few words briefly on the situation in Sudan. It sounds like it's genuinely improving. Um, some of the decades old Islamist laws are being scrapped. There is genuinely some good outcomes from last year's revolution. And an encouraging thing about that revolution, incidentally, was the central role that women played in it. Um, but I remember a time when a British teacher was sentenced to death because she had a competition in her classroom to name, I think it was teddy bears, so were being named, and one student chose to name Muhammad, which in an Islamic country is common, but this was seen as insulting to the Prophet, and well, the teacher ended up on death row, basically. It was a terrible case. That was about 12 years ago, around 2007, 2008. That was Sudan then. Sudan today, certainly not problem free. These things don't happen overnight, but I think it's definitely on a good path, and that's to be welcomed. But now I've just read about a situation in Tunisia, which is a country that escaped the worst of the Arab winter. That is to say, it didn't kind of fall into anarchy the way Libya did, or full-on civil war the way Syria did. Um, and in I think it was 2016, the Tunisian Quartet Council, I forget the formal name off the top of my head, but they won the excuse me, Nobel Peace Prize. I think it was about 2016, sometime in the mid 2010s anyway, which was an indicator of the positive direction the country was going in. Um, However, this ruling maybe casts another light on the situation in Tunisia, and I'm going to read this report out. Um, doesn't say the name of the report, it just says by Reuters. So via the New York Times by Reuters. Tunis. A Tunisian court has sentenced blogger Emna Chargu, and I trust I'm pronouncing that name right, to 6 months in prison and a $700 fine for reposting a Facebook joke about the coronavirus written as if it was a Quranic verse. This is unfair and unjust. This proves that there is no freedom here, Chargu, 27, told Reuters from home where she had been waiting for the ruling. She plans to appeal as allowed within 10 days. Argu's sharing of the post in May angered some conservative social media users who demanded punishment in a nation periodically polarized between secular and Islamist political wings since the revolution that introduced democracy 9 years ago. This was, of course, in the 2011 Arab Spring movements and revolutions. Court spokesman Mohsin Dali said the sentence was on charges of inciting hate between religions and races. So this isn't a blasphemy law, technically. It sounds actually more akin to the sort of laws that did exist in Malaysia and Singapore previously. The case has brought criticism from rights groups, saying she was a victim of a repressive law that curtailed free speech. Amnesty International said the prosecution did not allow Chargu's lawyer to accompany her to court. Well, that's certainly contentious. But she was asked about her religious beliefs and mental condition. Chargu's blogs on freedom and women's issues. She blogs on those subjects. The reporting's by Tariq Amara, writing by Angus McDowell, editing by Andrew Cawthorne. So this isn't being described as a blasphemy law. Nevertheless, whatever way you gloss it over, she is ostensibly being punished for offending Islam. Now, bear in mind this is Tunisia. This is not Pakistan. This is not Iran. This is not Saudi Arabia. It's not a country that is usually associated with hardline Islamist dogma. But to me, this just reiterates that if this can happen in a relatively moderate Islamic society, That just gives you an idea of what it's like in more intolerant societies. I mean, in Pakistan, it's very likely she would have got a much longer sentence or possibly even a death sentence. Um, I don't think that's an exaggeration. Certainly, if she was living in an area controlled by Islamist militants, say Boko Haram in northern Nigeria or Al Shabaab controlled areas of Somalia, at least that would have been the case a few years ago. Um, Taliban controlled areas of Afghanistan. You can imagine the outcome. Um, I don't know the nature of the joke. Maybe it was crude. Maybe it was a bit inflammatory. I mean, Amos Yee in Singapore got in hot water for making inflammatory posts about Christians. Now, I didn't support his rhetoric, but it was the heavy-handed penalties that were a bit problematic. Um, I think this maybe has more echoes of the Singapore situation. Nevertheless, I think that short of inciting violence, I don't think anyone should be jailed for an opinion or a joke unless it is explicitly threatening violence. That may be even a tasteless joke. I wouldn't even say someone should be jailed, for example, for mocking a disaster. I would criticize them. I would say that's really in bad taste. And there are certain comedians I think are lowlifes. But I wouldn't even say, okay, prosecute them or jail them. I mean, if common sense has to apply, if, for example, let's say you had a comedian made a joke about Grenville in North Kensington, I understand why that would be very inflammatory and insulting to survivors and victims of that tragedy. Um, but jail? No, I wouldn't jail them. This is actually a very important question, isn't it? Because it gets into the boundaries of freedom of expression. Um, but I would say this, those Islamist conservatives, all they do when they pick up a cauldron with these sort of situations is they actually show Islam to be a very weak faith insofar as very, very sensitive, can't handle criticism. Now, surely, if Islam is so powerful and so great, then who cares about one woman making a joke online? But that's not the case. The reality is, Islamists, time and time and time again, show how super sensitive they are, how they simply cannot bear hearing out any dissenting views or even a joke. And like I say, I don't know the precise nature of this joke. Maybe it was in bad taste. I don't know. But even if that were the case, firstly, she was sharing it, so she didn't create the joke. Secondly, jail is clearly excessive for that. And thirdly, like I say, it shows the super sensitivity of Islam. And I say Islam, the faith. Um, so when certain Muslims boast about how wonderful and they'll say like Islam's the fastest growing religion. Well, it's also the most sensitive religion apparently. And this is not even by any means the most extreme sort of case. She could get 6 months in prison, which is bad, but it's not a death sentence, it's not a lashing. I'm just making the point that that's a moderate example of the tolerance of Islam. So I'm sorry, no one can convince me that Islam is progressive so long as this sort of thing continues. No one can convince me it's tolerant so long as this sort of thing continues. There are many decent Muslims, there's many peaceful Muslims, there's many very reasonable Muslims. But Islam, no. As long as this sort of stuff goes on, you cannot convince me that it's progressive. You just can't. It's a contradiction in the reality. Okay, I'll put a link to the article. By the way, New York Times, you can read the article with a free subscription. I've just learned that. I have been critical of the New York Times, and I will remain critical. But even the regressive left can sometimes get it right.